Thank you, Manfred, and thank all of you for coming out today. Can you hear me in the back? A little louder? I'll try and lean over the mic a bit. The Oslo process was supposed to bring about, finally, genuine peace between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs more broadly. Instead, it led to the worst terror assault Israel's ever experienced. A question that I look at from the perspective of being a psychiatrist and historian, a question that interests me is why do communities, why do nations sign on to policies, embrace policies that are predictably going to lead to disaster? Now, an obvious question is, well, was this predictable? I think it very much was if you look at what Arabs, Arafat, those associated with him, Palestinians, Arabs more broadly, were saying, not in English, not to Western reporters or Western diplomats, but in Arabic to their own people before Oslo, during the initial days of Oslo, and in the weeks and months that followed. What they were saying, what they were doing. Arafat, for example, on the very night of the handshake on the White House lawn, said something he'd said in the previous weeks and in subsequent weeks to Arab audiences. He was on, that night, he was on Jordanian television and told his constituency that they should understand Oslo as the first stage in the PLO's plan of phases, the first phase in the plan of phases. That's a 1974 plan adopted by the PLO, which said we'll take whatever we can get by negotiations and use that as a base from which to pursue Israel's annihilation. He said it that evening, he'd said it before, he said it at least a dozen times within the first few weeks of Oslo. In a similar vein, he compared Oslo to a treaty that Muhammad had signed in the year 628, and 2 years later, when his forces were stronger, he attacked his co-signatories and defeated them. And of course, there were all the calls for jihad. Not only was there the incitement and the claims of how he understood and how his people should understand Oslo, but there was also the terror. From his arrival in the territories in July of '94 until the defeat of the initial Oslo government, the Labor Meretz coalition in May of '96, in those 22 months, over 150 Israelis were killed. To that point, an unprecedented level of terror. Of course, it pales compared to what happened after September 2000, but again, at that point, unprecedented. Yet Israel went on making concessions. Indeed, in the fall of '95, it signed on to Oslo too. What's the explanation? Now, some of the most interesting comments come from people who were Oslo enthusiasts and subsequently rethought their position. For example, Nissim Tzvili was a Labor MK during this period, and he was a member of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And he said in 2002, quote, "I remember myself lecturing in Paris and saying that Arafat's double talk had to be understood. That was our thesis, proved later as nonsense. Arafat meant every word and we were naive." So his explanation is naivety. I don't buy into that. If you think about Peres, Rabin, others involved in it, whatever adjectives you would apply to them, positive, negative, neutral, naive is not high on the list. These were not naive men. A more interesting comment came from Ari Shavid a few years earlier, in '97, before the terror war was launched, but certainly after that terror period in '94 to '96. And Ari Shavid's a writer for Haaretz. As you know, all the Israeli dailies, all the Hebrew dailies, were generally supportive of Oslo. There was very little coverage of what was really going on in the PA in terms of incitement, indoctrination, schools, mosques. In fact, Israel had to be establish underground organizations in a sense, like Memory and Palestinian Media Watch, to cover that because the media weren't. And certainly Haaretz, being the most ideological, was most supportive, and Shavid himself was supportive. And he said in '97, talking about his involvement in and all the political elites' support of Oslo, and then the support of the other elites in Israel, intellectual, cultural elites. Quote, "In the early '90s, we the enlightened Israelis were infected with a messianic craze. All of a sudden, we believed that the end of the old Middle East was near, the end of history, the end of wars, the end of conflict. We fooled ourselves with illusions. We were bedazzled into committing a collective act of messianic drunkenness." Well, messianic drunkenness is a colorful description, and it captures something of the mood, but it's not an explanation for it. What I suggest in my book is that the explanation lies in the psychology of chronically besieged populations. Whether you're talking about minorities that are marginalized, defamed, attacked, or small states under chronic siege by their neighbors. And virtually invariably, segments of those populations take as truth the indictments, no matter how biased, how bizarre, how absurd, the indictments of their enemies. And they do so in the hope that by reforming themselves in a way consistent with those indictments, they will end the siege. They will win relief. And at an individual level, on a psychological level, a paradigm would be the psychology of abused children. Chronically abused children, which usually means people subjected to chronic parental abuse. Almost invariably, the children blame themselves. I'm abused because I'm bad, and if I become good, my situation will improve. Now, if you look at the psychiatric, psychological, social work literature, this is commonly ascribed, it's noted, but it's commonly ascribed to childhood naivety. Essentially, they're saying, well, the children are told by the abusive parents, you're bad, and that's why we're doing this to you in one way or another. That's the message conveyed, and in their naivety, the children embrace that as a reality. But children aren't that naive. A son of an alcoholic father who comes home in a drunken rage several nights a week and beats him knows that he's being abused. But it's very common, it's almost invariable, particular ages especially, that he will repress that and blame himself and say, my father's acting this way because I'm doing something wrong. And if I do something better, if I become good, if I get better grades in school, or have his dinner ready when he comes home, or clean the house, or make more money on my paper road, or some other way of appeasing, of becoming, quote, good, then he'll treat me differently. And it's not naivety that drives this. You think of the existential predicament of the child. Either he reconciles himself to being in a hopeless situation. This is his entire world. He can imagine that really has no grip on any other kind of world. And he is victim. There's nothing he can do about it. Or instead, he deludes himself into seeing himself as at fault, and then has to deal with the guilt or the self-indictment of I am bad, but preserves the hope that if I become good, I will win relief. And children reach for hopefulness, avoid hopelessness at all costs, just as adults do. And on a communal basis, on a communal level, you see the same pattern recur in communities under siege. Certainly you see it throughout the history of the diaspora. Segments of the community embracing this kind of, embracing indictments of their enemies, driven by this psychodynamic. And you see it in Israel, in the face of chronic siege. And it's not just a Jewish thing. People say, Jewish is self-hatred, the self-indictment is particularly a Jewish thing. That's not quite true. I think, again, you see it in other communities under siege. Interestingly, and remember, Ari Shavitz notes particularly how the elites in Israel embraced Oslo. The Thurgood Marshall, remember, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice in the United States, in a case in 1977, in a concurring opinion that he wrote, begins by saying, it's well known among social scientists that the elites of minorities commonly embrace the wider society's bias against their own minority. And he's not talking about Jews, he's not talking about African Americans. In fact, the case had to do with a different minority, it had to do with Mexican Americans. But this is, I cite that just to give you an idea, again, to reinforce the point it's not specifically a Jewish situation, and that other people acknowledge that. But what makes it particularly Jewish is the Jews' particular history of being under siege, whether in the diaspora or in Israel. Again, people aren't helpless in the face of this. The only response needn't be self-indictment, and clearly not everyone in the community embraces self-indictment. But on a larger communal level, the defenses, the major defense against self-indictment are institutions. If institutions are powerful, communal institutions convey a different message that the community has an integrity, that it's your enemies that are immoral, not you, and so forth. And that you have a purpose in life, you have a place in the world, and a future, then that could strengthen people, arm them against the indictment. The equivalent, going back to the psychological paradigm, would be the abused child who has someone else in his life, a grandparent, say, or an aunt or an uncle, who can't perhaps get him out of that situation, but conveys to him that It's your parents who are sick, who are, doing bad things, not you. And at least if it cannot perhaps protect them quite physically sufficiently, but can protect them from the psychological corrosiveness of the siege. And institutions, communal institutions, can do the same thing to communities under siege. The problem is, if you look at modern Jewish history and what happened to communal institutions in the context of, say, the last 300 years, the emergence of the modern nation state, communal institutions have been weakened for various reasons. And Jews were even more susceptible to this to the psychological corrosiveness of the siege. So much so that Max Nordau, interestingly, said about 100 years ago, Max Nordau, the Austrian Jewish writer, intellectual, early Zionist, said about 100 years ago that the greatest success of the anti-Semites is that they've gotten the Jews to look at themselves through anti-Semitic eyes. Now, you can see this on an individual basis, about self-perception. The kid who gets beaten up in the schoolyard every day, you're a Jew, and he's cursed as a Jew, and he's beaten, doesn't integrate that. Again, if there aren't enough defenses, institutional familial defenses around, it doesn't integrate that into something's wrong with me, and how do I become good enough so that they'll stop abusing it, that they'll accept me? Nordau could have added that it's even more true, in a sense, in terms of divisions in communities. So that, if you look at European anti-Semitism in the 19th century, early 20th century, you had German Jews blaming Polish Jews, the Eastern Jews, for anti-Semitism. Or you had secular Jews blaming religious Jews. You had socialist Jews blaming the Jewish bourgeoisie and the Jewish intellectual elite, and on the other hand, the Jewish bourgeoisie blaming the socialists. Zionism was not immune from this. Certainly Herzl's concept was of a state that would be for all Jews, and would not only physically protect Jews, because they would have a state in which to defend themselves, but would also relieve Jews of the psychological corrosiveness of the siege. They'd no longer be under siege from the surrounding Gentile population, and so they would not be subjected to the same assault, and they would not, therefore, manifest the same psychological, the corrosive effects of this psychological assault. But if you look at, for example, the main body of the Zionist movement in the early part of the 20th century, the socialist Zionists out of Russia, and you look at the literature and what they said and what about religious Jews or bourgeois Jews, very often parrots the anti-Semitic literature about religious Jews or bourgeois Jews. Now, the anti-Semitic literature is also directed at secular Jews and at socialist Jews, but they were choosing to see it in a particular way. And their concept of a new Jew, for example, was not simply that, well, he'd be a new Jew because he'd be in his own land, but he or she would be a new Jew because they'd be secular and socialist. And that would also have an impact in changing the world's perception of them and making it more benign. And this had political consequences. It had political consequences in terms of reluctance to open immigration more widely to bourgeois Jews and to religious Jews. Even in the 30s, even when Ben-Gurion finally came around to working with Jabotinsky and said, let's have a campaign in the West to push the British to open, there are segments of the social Zionist elite, the rulers, the main figures in the Yishuv, who will say, well, wait a second, what will that do to the great experiment, the great socialist secular experiment that they conceive to be true Zionism? And it also had an effect on the response to the Arab attack, as Manfred suggested in 29. But even you go back to 20, and then 29, and then to 36 and 39, there were elements of the socialist Zionist movement that, for example, had embraced socialist universalism. But the question is, what did those people do when Jews are then attacked? Do they have to rethink and say, well, Jews need a place to protect themselves? No, what many of them did reinforce and say, well, the socialist the universalist socialist image is a future, and we don't want a state. No, they responded to the attack by reinforcing, by embracing the indictments and somehow seeing the pursuit of statehood as evil, and were willing to forego it, not simply because of their ideology of the socialist universal ideology, but that ideology was actually reinforced by the assault. And they were even more eager to forego and say, if we forego the state, and they don't say it, people who embrace the indictments of the enemies never say, well, I suggest this in order to placate the anti-Semites. or I suggest this in order, to endear ourselves with the people who hate us. They always cast it as some noble or futuristic or progressive agenda. So they say, so the socialist Zionists would say, or those who embraced an anti-state track, would say, well, statehood is the past, and we Jews should be forward-looking. We should be ahead of everybody else, so we have to look beyond statehood to universalist principles. And the same Manfred referred to Buber. There's an older whole anti-state intellectual stream that came out of the German Jewry, the German academics who came here, among others, who were influenced by, certainly in the West, with emancipation, in quotes, with offering those who were resistant to giving rights to Jews would say, well, they're a separate nation. Why should we? What does it mean to embrace them as Germans or as Frenchmen or as British when the Jews are a separate nation? And the Jews were eager to forego that perception of themselves. And so even in the early 19th century, in religious reform, they wanted to eliminate a reference to Zion, eliminate a reference to Jerusalem, because they wanted to be accepted. And this perspective, and again, they didn't say, well, we're doing this to placate our enemies. They said, we're doing this because, well, Judaism has moved beyond that, beyond national identity, a local place. We're now a universal religious, we have a universal religious, moral, ethical mission. And to re-embrace nationalism, to re-embrace Zion is atavistic, is going backward. And Buber brought this, and this explanation for it here, and in the Yeshuv, even in the 30s again, they were against pursuing a state. In fact, Buber says, against Ben-Gurion, against those who want to promote immigration, who want to pursue statehood, Ben-Gurion says, we think this is a current thing, we're comparing Jews to Nazis in academics in Israel or others in Israel. Buber said it in the 30s. Ben-Gurion, the Jews in the Yeshuv had adopted Hitler, because they become Hitlerite because they're pursuing nationalism, and that's the Hitlerite agenda in the 30s. Now these perspectives were somewhat marginalized by events, by the war, by the Shoah, by the creation of the state, and the country obviously came together to bring in the remnants of survivors in Europe, to bring in the refugees from the Arab world, from the Muslim world. But there were other things that accounted for the marginalization. One is that people were hopeful. They hoped the siege was about to end. And this is a kind of moving target. But first they said, well, it's going to end because we're an established fact now. Fait accompli, people have to reconcile themselves to the existence of the state. Well, that didn't happen. Then they said, well, it's because the colonialists are still here. Britain always played an agent provocateur role in the Jews versus the Arabs. We were dealing with Abdullah, and it was British officer-led Arab Legion that invaded and prodded on by Britain. Things might have been different if Britain were gone, so when Britain leaves, things will be better. And then it was, well, it's the old potentates in the Arab world, and when they leave, things will be better. And you can go on, but there were elements of optimism that, again, was a moving target, but helped marginalize this perspective. There was also the fact that, of course, the state was led by labor Zionists, with whom the vast majority of labor Zionists identified, people with whom they identified. And so this, too, kept these anti-state or very critical, very self-critical opinions somewhat marginalized. Now that key element changed dramatically in 77. And after 67 war, you had people, the same marginalized proportion, probably, estimates at the time say about 5% of the population, who said, the issue now is really the territories we captured in the war. Just give everything back. Go back to the 67 armistice lines, the Arabs will give us peace. They were saying this despite Khartoum, despite the 3 no's of no recognition, no negotiation, no peace. But this did not have a lot of traction in the wider population. In 77, you get your first non-socialist Zionist government. Now, clearly, Likud ultimately articulated a perception, we'll talk about Judea-Samaria, very different from what Labor was saying. Ostensibly very different. Labor was talking about long plan variations. We hold on to key strategic areas around Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, other areas, that's Etzion Block, widen the narrow neck of Israel, the 9 kilometer or so width of Israel, widen that, and other key strategic areas, but they were generally sparsely populated. We give back the densely populated areas, and that'll to Jordan ideally, and that'll be a settlement. And the Likud was talking about autonomy, was saying, what does it mean to give back the historically, religiously most central areas, to return them from Jewish control, and also what does it mean to have a line on the Jordan, if you have, even strategic terms, if you have an enemy in the rear of that line. The differences weren't as stark as commonly described, and we can talk about that. But in any case, both parties, the Labour, Likud, anticipated the siege was going to continue, and Israel had to maintain a strategic capacity to respond to that. And both of them did not think that those who were saying, well, just give back the land and we'll get peace, were dealing at all with reality. But what happened when you had a government for the next 15 years, either as the government or as an equal partner or as a dominant partner in government, that with whom much of the Zionist left did not identify, that is, much of the Zionist left saw this as an alien other Israel. And that concept of alien others within a community is something that's always exacerbated, always sharpened by besiegement. Once that happened, within the broader Zionist socialist realm, it became easier for the sharper critique, the critique of the state, or the critique of the Zionist agenda, to make headway. Because in a sense you could say, they knew not Ben Gurion. You know, that old comprehension of the state was pushed aside. You had a government with whom they didn't identify, and a more and more common view was, well, the Arabs really, obviously Zionists, social Zionists and others, had to ask themselves, well, the whole Zionist concept was, you know, we would create this new Jew in the new land, and we would be a normal people because we have a land like everybody else, and we'd be at peace. Why hasn't it happened? And the explanation became very easy. Well, it was the new Jew that was going to be at peace. It was a social secular Jew. And the problem is, it's the old Jews are controlling the state. You know, remember the old Liberal Party, anti-socialist party had become part of Gahal, had become part of Likud, and of course you had the more religious, and the Sephardim community was more religious, and they were craftsmen, tradesmen, and so forth, and you had the Ashkenazi that supported Likud tended to be more religious. So it's the old Jews, the religious, and the bourgeoisie that were controlling the state. If we could wrest it back from them and make the proper concessions, then the Arabs would happily make peace. And what you also had then are these other movements sort of in track with the peace movement to reinforce that comprehension. You had the development of a bogus history, the new history. It doesn't stand up as history, but the whole rationale was to indict Israel. Say, well, if we could see ourselves as more culpable in the 748 war, in the fighting terrorism, in the quote terrorism in the 50s, the way they put it, if we see ourselves as having maltreated the Arabs, then we can rationalize the assault. We can make it a common sense of the assault, and we can pursue this. We can get the people to recognize, if they only make the concession, they'll acknowledge their guilt, acknowledge they were bad, and become good, make the proper concessions, and we can win peace. And you get the post-Zionist stream. You know, the problem is the state's too Jewish, and if we change the flag, and if we get rid of Hatikvah, and if we end the law of return, then we can get peace. And the divorce, I'll just give you one quote, the divorce between the way the Palestinians were perceived, the attitudes were perceived, and the reality that the peace movement chose to, and the burgeoning peace movement chose to ignore. This is a quote from Faisal Husseini in 1992. Remember Faisal Husseini, the PLO's menuetist in Jerusalem before Israelis were talking to PLO and people were talking to him. This is 92 speaking to an Arab audience. We have not conceded and will not surrender any of the commitments that have existed for more than 70 years. We have within our Palestinian and United Arab Society the ability to deal with divided Israeli society. We must force Israeli society to cooperate with our Arab society and eventually to gradually dissolve the Zionist entity. And he made other statements in the same vein. Now this is from Mordecai Bar-On. Mordecai Bar-On was the founder of Peace Now, a very forceful member of the peace movement, and wrote the definitive history of the peace movement. And this is what he wrote about this period immediately before Oslo, the period from which that Faisal Husseini quote is taken. Quote, a new generation of Palestinian leaders was emerging. Younger people like Faisal Husseini. Most of the peace groups on the Israeli side maintained contacts with these new leaders and tried to persuade Israelis that these Palestinians could be partners in negotiations. So here Faisal Husseini is making clear his agenda is the standard agenda of Israel has to be destroyed and we have the capacity to destroy it. And the peace movement was ignoring that taking any piece you might say in a different vein, in Hebrew or in English, to them, and saying, this is the new Palestinian. They are our partners for peace. And even the indoctrination that went on in the territories after 93, even the terrorist assault from 94 to 96 did not change this opinion. After Arafat launches, after you have Camp David and the other Taba negotiations, then Arafat launches terror war. Before the Taba negotiations, some opinion began to change, and people began to wake up from the delusion of Oslo. But of course, it's far from everybody did so, by a long shot. And the key issue is that the siege is going to continue. We see it now in the context of Hamas's victory, but obviously if Hamas didn't win, whatever the results of the election, the Arab siege is going to continue. And in fact, the siege will end at the Arabs' timing, not Israel. Israel has no influence whatsoever on the ending of the siege, because the attack on Israel, like the indictments of the United States and the Arab world, have such utility in terms of domestic Arab, somewhat to the degree broader Muslim, particularly domestic Arab politics, in terms of inter-Arab politics. And Israel has no capacity, impressive place, obviously, for a country of 6 million. But you compare it to the Arab world of 300 million, it has no capacity to determine. Israel ideally is strong enough, ideally, to defend its people, but it cannot force peace upon the Arabs. But it's that very helplessness to elicit peace that inspires and reinforces the delusion, the push to deluded thinking that we can have some influence. The desire for peace and the inability to, in reality, influence it drives the delusion of influence. And the siege is going to continue. And so it remains an open question. And you see, as Manfred said, you see worrisome signs here and there. Certainly, there's some who were not impressed by Arafat's war. And whenever there's any kind of ceasefire at all, or any kind of diminution of the violence, and even when the violence is not diminished, you will get people to say, well, if we did this, that, and the other, peace will come. And the question is, can Israel... obviously, the siege does cast a shadow over life in Israel. On the other hand, you've built an amazing society here, despite that, and 80% of people say they enjoy their lives here and would not want to live anywhere else. You know, the question is, can you continue nurturing? Well, people are prepared, enough people are prepared to continue nurturing what you've built. Or again, in their eagerness for, quote, normalcy, unquote, be prepared to risk everything to reach out to chase mirages of peace. I think there are optimistic, there are things people can do and bases for optimism. Again, the country responded to the terror war in a way that was extremely impressive, not just the IDF, but the citizenry generally. I think education is key. The government of 92, 96, the education ministry essentially tried to de-Judaize, de-Zionize the curriculum. And you can argue there wasn't enough there to begin with. But certainly whatever there was watered down by Shulamit Aloni and her successor in the education ministry. And some of that's been reversed. And I think, you can give somebody a good education in Zionist history and Jewish history and history of the Yishuv and everything, and they'll still go over this side. But at least you're arming them with something. I think this can be reinforced. I think there are other things that can be reinforced in the government elsewhere. And I think, again, there's some basis for optimism, too. And so even, again, the more Live Not has rolled back some of that. I think more can be done there and would be very useful. I'll stop there and